We've been doing a lot of statistics on tonight's show, so here's a couple more. You know this Northern Ireland Protocol, under which one of our 4 home nations remains in the EU single market, and thus domestic goods going from one corner of the UK to another have to undergo customs checks if they ever go across the sea to Belfast. Well, courtesy of a report by the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, we learn, quote, 20% of all customs checks carried out in the EU take place on goods crossing the Irish Sea, even though just 0.2% of goods entering the single market arrive via that route. So the Irish border, the Irish Sea customs checks between Britain and Northern Ireland now have more customs checks than any half-dozen EU member nations. It's almost like Brussels is using the pretext of the single market to teach Britain a lesson. Lady Hoey is back with us. Kate, this is more relevant, isn't it, than all the protocol negotiations, because it shows that there's a punitive aspect to this.
I think the figures are actually shocking. The idea that for that tiny amount of trade that is coming across from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and then that a very, very tiny part of that might just go on into the European Union's single market in the Republic of Ireland, means that 20% of all their checks are going into this little bit, this little corner of the whole of the so-called wonderful European Union. It is shocking, and it's getting that kind of statistic out is really important, because most people don't really understand the detail, and this gives it a very clear focus, because every individual in Northern Ireland is affected daily because you can't get things, or things are more expensive coming over.
No, and in fact, businesses, I mean, it's not just a hypothetical thing or a bureaucratic thing. It actually adds hundreds of pounds to every pallet of goods crossing between Britain and Ulster and Britain.
Yes, it adds to the costs. It adds to the bureaucracy. I mean, we've met people who literally held up hundreds of pages of documents that they've had to fill in to be able to send something across to their own country, and yet no one seems to think that no one in the European Union seems to think that is certainly gone against what even I'm sure Boris Johnson thought that the protocol would mean. I mean, those of us who warned against it could see that there was going to be difficulties, but I think the way the European Union has brought it in is just made the situation so much worse, and businesses now are refusing to send things to Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland citizens are having to look elsewhere, and that's obviously pleasing the Irish government, because quite a lot of stuff now is being sourced from the Republic. So there's a diversion of trade, which of course within the protocol, Article 16 said one of the things that shouldn't happen was that diversion of trade, and it's happening daily. So we're still in the middle of the protocol bill going through the House of Lords. We've had 2 days, we've got a third day tomorrow and a fourth day next week. And I'm afraid it's all going to end up, when we get to report stage with votes, with a very large number of peers amending it so that it ends up being completely hopeless, and will then go back to the Commons, and Rishi Sunak will have to decide, does he care about the Union? Does he care about Northern Ireland? Or does he care more about keeping the EU happy?
Well, it's a basic rule of negotiation that you don't get into a bad faith negotiation. And the fact that they've installed this level of so-called customs checks in the Irish Sea shows that from the European point of view, this has always been bad faith. And in that sense, the government should, which is a pretty big player. I know it doesn't behave like one, but it's still a G7 nation. It's still part of the permanent 5 at the UN. Why doesn't it just tell the EU to take a hike on all this rubbish?
Well, of course, we've got a Parliament full of lawyers who go on about international law and breaking treaties. I mean, my view on that is that the Belfast Agreement was an international treaty. It came first. And if you've got two treaties that are actually in contradiction, then you go for the one that stands up for your own citizens in your own country. And I'm afraid there are some of my colleagues who seem to want to help and support the EU more than the United Kingdom. And of course, we're still in grace periods, these periods that were allowed for some things not to be quite implemented fully. Now, those grace periods, if they end, it's been again made very clear that it's actually going to really, really stop much of our trade coming over from Great Britain. So, we're not. And the other worrying thing, of course, Mark, at the moment is that, within the unionist, loyalist community, there is real anger and frustration. And we're in a situation where we're now in limbo. The Parliament isn't working. And the Secretary of State keeps changing his mind about whether there's going to be another election or not. And the situation is people are warning that it is very, very dangerous what's happening. So I think the government needs to, they've got a lot of things on their plate, and we know that. But, the protection of Northern Ireland, their own citizens, and protection of the Union should be pretty high up, I would say, their agenda.
Well, they're mocking Britain in Brussels, aren't they? They're teaching them the lesson that if you're determined to leave the European Union, we're going to screw you over. And they're doing that in case any of these Central and Eastern member nations were to start showing little Brexity signs. So we know why they're doing that. We just don't understand why London is basically just lying there and taking it from these guys.
I think that's what makes me very, very angry. I've seen over a number of years our own government refusing to stand up for Northern Ireland. The Irish government stands up all the time for nationalists in Northern Ireland, and our own government keeps pretending that they sort of have to be neutral. And of course, they don't have to be neutral at all. And the British government isn't certainly neutral. And that's the kind of thing that over and over again, we just feel that we are being slowly abandoned. And I think someday somebody will waken up and realise, I hope, that what they're doing is actually very, very damaging to the whole of the Union of the United Kingdom. And again, the promises are made, but we keep saying we need action. It's a bit like the Suella Braverman case and the migrants coming in. Words are wonderful, but we need action, and we need action on the protocol.
You're absolutely right, Kate. We're going to have